career. A little bit about myself. My name is Mike Chamness. My career, I've had two different careers. One was as a sports writer in Carbondale, and for a few years here at the State Journal-Register. Transitioned to state government as a communications director, but I ended up the last 20 years of my career as the director of the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, and then as the chairman of the Illinois Terrorism Task Force. Tell a little bit, Bernie asked me to talk about my faith journey. My parents took me to church from the time I was this tall, but I can't tell you I was a true follower of Jesus Christ until later in my life. I witnessed a miracle, and I'll apologize in advance. This may be difficult for me to talk about, so give me a little grace. I have two daughters. My youngest daughter, Cindy, was a sophomore. We found out she was anorexic. Now, to a lot of people, that means you don't eat, but it's really a mental illness. We went everywhere. She was on the verge of death. She was in our home, and she could not get out of bed. We found a place in Arizona called Remuda Ranch. It's a Christian-based treatment center. They take 25 people at a time. We got her a spot, but when they talked to her, she didn't want to go, and they said, we only have 25 spots. We won't take people who don't want to get well. At that point, it didn't look good for Cindy. Her heartbeat was so slow, she was literally on the verge of death. I had an important job I talked about. I couldn't go to work one day. I just could not do it. I prayed for Cindy. Literally. This is many years later. Within 1 minute of finishing that prayer, the phone rang. This is before cell phones. It was Remuda Ranch. This was now 5 weeks later. They called back and they said, we just want to check on your daughter. I mean, who does that? They only have 25 spots. I said, well, she can't get out of bed. Can we talk to her? Will she talk to us? Long story short, I knocked on her door. She talked to them. We were on a plane.
Yeah! Hallelujah!
She was healed in that Christian place. So my prayer, I witnessed a miracle. When I did the Leonard story, they suffered tragedies. They lost a son in an auto accident. He lost his first wife to breast cancer. So I asked myself, miracles, why do some people get miracles and others don't? My wife and I happened to be near Portland visiting my brother. We stopped in a church. We just drove in a parking lot. Something was going on their staff. I don't know what, but the title of the minister's sermon that day was, Are There Miracles? I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. He said yes. Some people are healed miraculously in the moment. Some people are healed over time, but all of God's followers are ultimately healed. I'm going to go through the book. I started out, again, I said I was a sports writer. About three and a half years ago, and Ken Leonard had announced in 2022 that it would be his last season of coaching after 39 years of coaching, winningest coach in state history. And I thought to myself, I was out watching my twin grandsons, they're now 12, play football at Hope Church, and Ken and Derek were there, and I thought, man, what a great football story this would be. I did not set out to write a book. When I retired, I wanted to retire. I had a nagging thought, I need to write this book. And that thought turned from the football story into a story about their family and their faith journey. And my goal in the book was to glorify God. Whether I accomplished that or not, the people who read it would have to determine that. What I'm going to do with the rest of my time, I'll go through and I'll pick out some parts of this book that I want to highlight about the Leonards' family life and about their faith journey. Ken Leonard left college and went and worked on the Alaskan pipeline for 2 years. It was his first time away from sports and football. He worked for his uncle's company on the Alaskan pipeline. It was really hard work in the most desolate areas of the world. It made him understand he wanted to go back to school, get his degree, and become a football coach. He ended up getting a job at Gridley. He grew up in Chenoa near Bloomington. Gridley's not far from Chinook. He ended up getting his first job at Gridley, and he coached there as head coach for 4 years, the best 4 years that little school had in football. The superintendent called him in and said, "Coach, I'm sorry, you did a great job, but we're shutting the program down." They only had 18 players. You couldn't safely run a program that way. The days before, you could combine with other schools. Now it's El Paso Gridley, a merged school. Ken's dream job was gone in an instant. The job at Sacred Heart at Griffin at that time opened up because Robin Cooper, the coach, had gone to McMurray College to start a football program. Ken applied. He was not the first choice at Sacred Heart Griffin. A guy named Chris Andriano, head coach of Montini School in Lombard, was offered the job and turned it down. He's one of the winningest coaches in state history. Ken met his team twice in state championship games, and Ken won both of those games. They're good friends. Longtime assistant Jim McMahon, who's a firefighter in Springfield, that's his day job, but he was Ken's defensive coordinator for many years, was a sophomore when Ken was hired. He remembered standing in the hallway when Ken was introduced at a press conference. He described it this way. He said, "I remember it like it was yesterday. He was wearing a plum-colored suit. He had big wig hair like he had a perm or something, and he's wearing cowboy boots. We all looked at each other and said, is he Liberace or John Wayne?" They quickly found out he was John Wayne. He took him to Camp Silka for a week. Those left standing were champions. One of those who almost quit was Jim McMahon. He said, "I puked." And he said, that was before practice, thinking about what was going to happen. He said, "I went to the coach and said, I can't do this. I'm going to quit." Ken said, "Go home and think about it for a day." Jim McMahon said, "I thank him every day for that." Derek Leonard's path to coaching. Derek applied first at Riverton and got turned down. When I asked Derek about that, he pointed me to Garth Brooks' song, Unanswered Prayers. Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. Remember when you're talking to the man upstairs, just because he doesn't answer doesn't mean he don't care. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. So Derek says Rochester was a perfect storm. He's not sure it would have happened at a different school. We'll talk now about a young man named Philip Pearson. Philip Pearson was the adopted son, a black child that was homeless, the adopted son of the Leonards. He didn't have a father. His mother was in prison because she murdered his cousin in front of Philip. The Leonards took guardianship. Derek knew Philip because he played basketball at a nearby boys club and got to know Philip. And Philip hung around at their house. They eventually adopted Philip. He had a really tough background and a lot of tough love in the Leonards' home. But Philip turned his life around. He was working, he had he was selling stuff at a mall near St. Louis and really had a successful life. People described him as someone that could talk anybody into anything. That was Philip's gift, and he was a good salesperson. One night he was with a friend, 4 people in the car. The driver had been drinking. He pulled in, filled his car up and gas down in the St. Louis area, took off at a high speed, had a single auto accident. 3 people were killed, including Philip. The only one who lived was the driver. Ken and Liz, Derek, and his brother Bradley were devastated. This is a boy who turned his life around, and then this happens. Ken and Liz went to the state's attorney in Madison County in Illinois and asked for leniency for the driver. Ken told me this: "Liz and I prayed a lot about that. It was not an easy choice. The other kids' kids who died were not happy with us. But vengeance was not going to bring Philip back, and a really long jail sentence would just ruin another life. From the cross, Jesus forgave those who were crucifying him. It was what we felt God was commanding us to do." During the visitation in Springfield here for Philip, I'm going to grab that. They were shocked. People they didn't know had come up from the metro area, and several of them said Philip talked to them about Jesus when he was selling stuff in the mall. In a roundabout way, Philip Pearson led Ken Leonard to the Lord. It was this way. There's a barber that Doug mentioned. He lives in Chatham. He's retired now. He's in his 80s. His name is Rick Braun. He pronounces it Brown. It's B-R-A-U-N. A wonderful man. He's a retired barber living in Chatham. I would describe him, and he would describe himself, as the least likely person that God might use to bring people to the Lord. He came to Springfield. He was deeply into the metaphysical. He had a weekly TV show on local cable access called The World Beyond. One of his regular guests was a woman named Greta Alexander, who claimed to have supernatural ties and could predict the future. But of course, the Bible, as you know, is full of people, unlikely people that God chose to do his work. Saul of Tarsus persecuted and killed Christians to become the Apostle Paul, who's credited with writing more than half of the New Testament. 90-year-old childless Sarah, wife of 99-year-old Abraham, whom God chose to be the father of the Jewish nation, despite laughing at the notion of her having a child at her age, she gave birth to Isaac. Through Isaac and one of his sons, Jacob, the family tree of Sarah and Abraham eventually would produce Jesus of Nazareth.
Amen. Amen. Hallelujah.
Rick's future wife, Jan, and her friend invited Rick to come to their little church in Auburn. Now, they were scared, so they prayed that week that the pastor wouldn't scare Rick off from Christianity. And they had a whole list of things that they prayed to God the pastor would not say. They showed up a little late and they had to sit in the front row. According to Jan, it was like the pastor had their entire list and he checked every box. He said every single one. Rick came back for an Easter service, and when the pastor asked if anybody wanted to commit their life to Christ, he was one of the first hands up. Rick had his first barbershop was near a place in Springfield, near what they used to call an attention house for orphaned kids. It would be under DCFS now. Philip was one of those, and Rick gave free haircuts to all of those kids. So here's how it happened. When the Leonards adopted Philip, Ken took Philip there to get his haircut. Pretty soon, Ken was getting his haircut, Derek his haircut, Bradley, his brother, his haircut there. Rick's first shop burned down. His second place was named Rick's Place. It was near Springfield High. It had two areas. It had a waiting area out here and in the back where he had a chair. In the waiting area was a large Bible on a stand and a picture on the wall of Jesus laughing uproariously. The picture came from Playboy magazine. Rick says, I envisioned Jesus being forgiving, full of joy, and having a sense of humor. Someone showed me the picture, so I got a copy of it and put it in my barbershop. Rick says, I never pushed my faith on people, but if they asked, I answered their questions and we talked. So many kids from Springfield High on their lunch hours came to that barbershop that the principal thought, what the heck's going on in that barbershop? So he went to see what was going on. His name was Chuck Hoots. He ended up getting his hair cut there. During this one day in the spring of 1992, Ken woke up feeling empty. It was not for lack of football success. He was in his 8th year as coach, and he was already the winningest coach at Griffin, now Sacred Heart Griffin High School. Earlier, he had talked with the principal, Sister Mary Paul. She suggested he talk to the bishop, Daniel Ryan. He went and talked to the bishop on this morning. He got in his car, and he felt a tremendous urge to go to Rick's barbershop. This is Rick telling the story. He said, I remember it vividly. He walked in and said, I don't need a haircut. I don't know why I'm here. Something is missing in my life. I'm struggling. I told him what's missing was Jesus Christ. I kept it simple. We prayed and talked about John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. A very short visit, it changed Ken Leonard's life. He had gone to church He was raised Catholic. He now is non-denominational, but he was raised Catholic, went to Mass. When he was coach, he took his team to Mass every Friday. He says at first he was angry nobody had told him these things, even though he'd been at church. His life was so different that his sons, now teens, Derek and Bradley, said, "Hey, Dad, please tone it down, man. You are embarrassing us." Ken says to this day, he will never try to offend anybody, but he lives by this: I won't compromise my faith. I'd rather offend people than offend God. He lives his life that way. Derek's faith journey is more behind the scenes, but it's just as strong. His office is a small, about the size of a broom closet. It's just off the basketball court in the Rochester Athletic Center. Above his office, in blue painter's tape, somebody taped across, and the words, "Mr. Coach Derek Leonard, lover of God." This is in a public school, but Derek understands his football success has given him a platform not a lot of people have. He said, "I didn't put it there, but I'm not taking it down." Former Superintendent Tom Bertrand tells how Derek befriended a special needs student named Faith. She was nonverbal with everyone but Derek. Graduation, she would not go across the stage. She was in tears. Until Derek took her across the stage. They send most of their special needs students. Derek teaches PE as part of his job. They send them to Derek because he is so good with people who have special needs. Kevin Elliott, the director of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in Central Illinois, and their banquet, by the way, is Monday night at the Crown Plaza. The speaker is a guy named Scott Hansen. If you're a football fan, Scott is the host of the Sunday NFL Red Zone. He used to be in TV here. Ken led him to the Lord, and in the book, he writes the introduction to the book, and it's powerful. Rochester normally takes more people than anybody to the FCA camp in Jacksonville. And so Kevin Elliott asked Derek, "Why is that? Even after these championships, you continue to bring these number of people." He says, "I know," Derek said to him, "I know this is what our kids need more than the X's and O's of football." He said, "They'll hear plenty about me, from me about football, but the message at the FCA camp is what I want them to hear first and foremost. That's what brings our team together." Talk a little bit now about the football. There's a lot of football in the book. The championships. Ken Leonard had become obsessed with winning a state championship. It took him 21 years to do that, despite his, and in those 21 years, they had great teams that lost in every way that you can imagine. Probably the worst of those. In 1995, Philip Pearson was a senior on this team. A man named Christian Gripper was a senior on this team. Derek Leonard was a sophomore at the time. The team was on the verge of one of the biggest upsets in state history, playing Providence Catholic. The Sun-Times this year rated the Providence Catholic team in 1995 one of the top 25 teams in Illinois state history. Sacred Heart Griffin led by 10 points with 4 minutes to play. They still led by 3 points with 2.5 minutes to play. The other team out of timeouts. They needed a first down and they win the first state championship. They hand the ball to Christian Gripper, the fullback who had never fumbled. Never. He fumbled. Providence Catholic recovered, scored a touchdown with 40 seconds left, and they lost. Ken Leonard said this. He said he was certain it was God's will for him to win that championship because now he had been born again. When I turned my life over to the Lord, I thought a state championship would be the perfect platform for me to glorify Him. I thought that winning that title surely was part of my destiny, but that's not how God works. That was probably the toughest football loss I've ever been a part of, but as I walked across that field after the game, I just felt the peace of Jesus Christ come over me. I realized I needed to glorify Him in that situation and in all situations. Christian Gripper's called the other brother. He had no father. He was the best friend to Philip Pearson, and he stayed at the Leonard household a lot and ended up living there for a while after Philip died. He remembers what Ken Leonard said to those players moments after that game ended. He said you could see the disappointment on his face, but he was just so calm. He told us lots of people at Sacred Heart Griffin ended their career with a loss. In fact, up to that point, all of them had. but went on to be winners in life. God has bigger plans for your life. It would take Ken 21 years to finally, okay, I'm going to erase.
You have 8 more minutes.
Took him 21 years to win a state championship. I titled that chapter A Very Heavy Monkey, and I describe how they lost all these games in many different ways. Galatians 6:9 speaks to perseverance, and let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. And he persevered and he won. He won his first state championship in 2005. The 2004 team was the team that should have won. The year before they had finished second, and they returned almost everybody, including a young man named Derek Leonard, who was one of the best quarterbacks ever to play. Went to Northwestern as a wide receiver, played for the Chicago Bears. 2005, he was gone. They only had 12 seniors. They won the state championship. In 2004, they got upset in the second round by a Jacksonville team, 21-14, a team they had beat 42-14 3 weeks earlier. The quarterback of the 2005 team was a guy named Bobby Bernisen, who was a sophomore in 2004, and he played a receiver that year. He was Eric Peterman's successor. He felt bad because late in that Jacksonville loss in 2004 as a sophomore, running back for Sacred Heart Griffin broke free, ran 73 yards to tie the game. There was a penalty flag they called clipping on Bobby Bernisen. They lost the game. Bernisen quarterbacked into the championship in 2005, again in 2006. In fact, Bobby Bernisen never lost a game. Freshman team unbeaten, sophomore team unbeaten, 2 years on the varsity unbeaten. Ken would end his career with 419 wins, the most of any coach in Illinois history, and 6 state championships. Derek also had to be patient. His best team probably was the 2009 team that lost to Metamora 41-40. When they decided to go for 2 points, they scored the tying touchdown, or would be the tying, with 4 seconds left. Derek decided he didn't want to put everything on the shoulders of the kicker to tie that game. He said we'd win or lose with 11 players. They came up 6 inches short. They then went on to win a state record 5 straight state championships, 8 state championships in a 10-year period. That's unprecedented for a public school in the state of Illinois, and added the 9th last year. First Lady of Sacred Heart Griffin, Elizabeth Liz Leonard, I didn't know her personally. She battled agoraphobia. I said to Ken, that's a fear of leaving your home. But she was the First Lady of Sacred Heart Griffin. She had to go places. Teacher's aide for 25 years. She had a teaching degree, but never wanted to be up front. She wanted to be a teacher's aide. She was comfortable in her home, in Ken's office, and that was about it. I said, that's like asking me to climb the side of a mountain. He said, no, Mike, it's like asking you to live on the side of that mountain. Her son Bradley had dyslexia. She spent hours with him and helped him overcome it. He's a successful businessman with a bank in Springfield right now. She taught Lindsay, Derek's wife, how to deal with a coach's criticism. She would sit by herself at games. She really didn't like football. Sit by herself, and one day she's with a friend, and there's 2 guys a row below, and they're mouthing off, criticizing Ken Leonard. Her friend says, what are you going to do about it? She said, nothing, God will take care of it. The game ends. Ken addresses his players, does a short radio interview when he always gave credit to Jesus, win or lose. And now he walks up the bleachers. These 2 guys are still there, and he sits down next to Liz. They are mortified. They had no idea they were mouthing off in front of the coach's wife. Liz turned to her friend and said, see, God took care of it. She battled breast cancer, took her life in 2017 after a 2-year battle. Ken had considered retiring earlier, but Liz, when she got sick, said, no, you need to keep coaching. You need that. His final season, and I'll close with this. He missed only his 2nd game as coach. He was sick. The 2nd round of the playoffs, they played Waterloo. They were heavily favored. He couldn't go. The man he handpicked to be his successor, a wonderful man named John Allison, had to take over as coach. It was only the 2nd time Ken missed a game. The first was when his father died, and they lost that game. When he was an assistant at Shinoa, the coach got suspended one game, and Ken had to coach that game. The only game they lost that year until the state championship game. Waterloo almost beat Springfield Sacred Heart Griffin that day. as Ken listened to it on the radio. But they came back and they won. They made it to the semifinals where they played Rochester. Rochester got up 28-0 in the semifinals. Sacred Heart Griffin came back and won that ball game. A tremendous comeback. Ken and Derek played each other in what's known as the Leonard Bowl 15 times. They hated it. Liz hated it. In fact, there was a picture in the State Journal-Register after one of the games, and Derek's pointing his finger at his father during the handshake line. Liz Leonard put the paper on the table and said to Derek, "Don't you ever point your finger at your father like that again." She turned to Ken and said, "Ken, what in the world did you do to make Derek mad enough that he would point his finger at you?" In perfect symmetry, the final game of Ken Leonard's career was his 500th game. State championship, they played Providence Catholic, that team I told you that beat them in 1995. Sacred Heart Griffin won 44-20. The first thing Ken Leonard said after his final game, as I was there, players circled, "Remember Jesus." He didn't want them going bragging about winning without giving credit to Jesus Christ. Ken said, "You know, when we finally won that first state championship, it wasn't long until I started thinking about next year's challenge. I was always searching for the next championship. There's nothing wrong with that, but it won't get you eternal happiness. I think that's what led me to Rick's Barbershop on that day." Marty Lamalino played for Ken, was an assistant coach. He was on Ken's first team at Gridley. He said he has 400 some odd wins, but he has helped some 4,000 boys become better men. I am one of those. I know Coach Leonard would say he's prouder of how those kids turned out than any win on the football field. Eric Peterman, in an interview with Scott Reeder of Illinois Times, a year ago, 2 years ago now, says, "My parents were divorced and my father really wasn't part of my life, so Coach stepped forward and helped me play that role. I had the unfortunate experience of losing my son. 4-year-old died with muscular dystrophy as well. When I was going through that, Coach Leonard was there for me, seeing how he lived his life and got through losing his son, gave me inspiration for dealing with that." And I conclude the book by saying that the impact of Ken Leonard's coaching career could not be measured when the clock at Memorial Stadium hit 00:00 on November 25th, 2022, because all the people's lives he touched are being spread from generation to generation. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you. I will, if anybody wants books, I left cards on the table. If you want to get one today, I'll leave some with Bernie. My grandsons are playing baseball tournament in O'Fallon. I'm headed there. I'll leave some. Any book that's sold here today, I didn't know you guys were doing a fundraiser. $5 each book will go to your fund here, okay, for however you see fit to use it. God bless you and thank you very much.